Hi. Okay, so I am here tonight with my friend Ondrej Bursik, who is in Australia. And Ondrej and we've been on each other's radar for a couple of years because we've been speaking at conferences together for a couple of years, but it was all online. And then just this last spring, we were able to actually meet in person at the Knowledge K Conversations conference in Tenerife. And so got to actually connect. And I invited him here tonight so that we could have this conversation about working with gems and with crystals, with muscle testing and with energetic healing, because it's something that I love, that I know lots of you love, but that also, I'm not an expert in, and he is. So, hey, Andre,
Hey, how are you?
I'm
Um,
great.
yeah, I mean, working with crystals, such a big field. I mean, I'll try to share with the audience as much knowledge as I can. Where do we start? Do we want to start with how I use it, or do we want to start with the history, or
Well, I think that a lot of us acquire them because there's something compelling about it, right? Like we see them in shops and metaphysical shops at conferences or something like that. We pick them up, they're shiny and they're pretty, and we get told things like, well, this has XYZ characteristics or frequencies. Then I think a lot of us take them home and put them on a shelf and don't really know what to do with them. So, maybe we could start with a little bit of like how they have historically been used, and then we can kind of morph that into how we're using them now for healing.
okay, well, what you just said there reminds me of a story that I usually share with students because I obviously teach about crystals. So, how about I share a 3 minute story with you, which will sort of get us started on how to use crystals.
Yes, please.
So, you can close your eyes for this if you like, if you're listening to this. So, let's just imagine that there is a cavity. It sits underground, perhaps 20, 30 meters. Rain travels through the soil, picks up minerals. And in this cavity, the water makes its way down. And over time, a crystal begins to form. Now, many crystals grow. They take thousands of years to grow. And so in this cavity, this particular quartz crystal, as an example, has been growing for thousands and thousands of years. And everything in the universe has a vibration, including this crystal. But then something happens. Something like someone sticks a dynamite into the mountain, blows it all up. They're probably searching for copper or for something else. And this particular crystal that was in this cavity for thousands of years gets blown to pieces. And most likely as a byproduct, it ends up on a belt, gets washed by water in boxes, then it gets sold to someone. And depending on who buys it, might resell it again, or they might just clean it. Depending on who they are, they might clean it ethically or unethically. They might shape it, or they might not shape it. And eventually, it ends up in a store. And then someone in the store puts a little card in front of it, and it says, "This is a master healer clear quartz. It helps you with energizing, and it does all these wonderful things." And the problem is that the crystal has gone through, let's say, so much trauma that it's probably not doing much at all. And I guess the first thing that I want to, share with the audience is that how you remove the crystals from the earth and what you do after will have a huge impact on whether they will actually help you or not. And so whenever I buy crystals, the first thing that I assume is that they haven't been cleansed, that they haven't been looked after. And often, if you are sensitive enough, you can feel it. The crystal doesn't feel vibrating in your hand. And so, when the question is, there's a crystal on my shelf, how do I use it? Well, I would say before you even begin to start considering using it, let's first cleanse it and let's charge it. Now, of course, not all crystals are removed that way. There are a lot of people that have very small family style companies that remove crystals, and some of them do it ethically. For example, I just purchased what's called sort of like a master crystal from the Amazon. And the people that remove it there, they get a permission from the local shaman that this can be allowed. And so when they arrive, when I buy them, we go through usually a month of cleansing the crystal before I would even begin to use it in clinic. So yeah, it's a little bit sad, but you do want to know where the crystal's coming from, and I guess you want to assume that it hasn't been cleansed properly. And so perhaps what we could do, Alexis, we could start talking about how do we cleanse and how do we charge crystals. Because for me, that's the first most important step. Without that, expecting that the crystal will somehow vibrate and having a positive effect on your body, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, so should I go into that?
Yeah, well, I'm curious because I think most of us, again, have heard things like, oh, you can cleanse them with a full moon, you can cleanse them with a new moon, you can cleanse them by washing them and putting them in the sun. You can do those things. But you just said a month. And when you said a month, I went, okay, I know for sure that I have never cleansed a crystal for a month. So,
Yeah.
all right, tell us how you would do that.
Well, I mean, let's skip a little bit forward and then I'll come back. So in clinic, I use crystals, and depending on what happens in session is I will put the crystal into a different area. So for example, I might be using selenite. Selenite is a great stone to help with sleep. It's very much a higher chakra stone. It's the best stone for actually aura cleansing. So if I'm doing aura work or if I'm cleansing, the energetic bodies, selenite would be my number one choice. Now, if I'm using it in a session, and let's say the session is not really highly charged. Yes, we have discussed things with the client, but there is no strong emotions that come up. The client is not getting frustrated. The client is not crying. It's just a nice session. Then I would still cleanse the crystal. I would always cleanse crystals after using them. However, like you said, that crystal might be cleansed, selenite being Selena, being the moon, probably best response to the moon. So, just overnight, preferably full moon, but it doesn't have to be, would be enough. But that's a very different story that if I would be using this crystal and the session that we go through is highly energized. Maybe the client is really letting go of something. For those of you that sort of do kinesiology, you probably have heard of the word NEFs, negative energy forms. Maybe the client has gone into, crying and really letting go of something powerful. Well, that vibration now is probably associated with that crystal. And so putting that crystal into the moonlight for an hour, I'm just not sure it's enough. And so in that case, it goes into a different category. And then I might do several different cleansing techniques, or I might cleanse it over a longer period of time. I wouldn't just selenite, you wouldn't wash underwater anyway, but I wouldn't just sort of wash it underwater and go, okay, yeah, it's okay. And so when I get crystals for the first time, I don't know the history. That's the problem. I don't know how many people it has gone through, what has this crystal gone. So I'm always assuming that just a quick cleanse is not going to be enough. So the first time when I buy crystals, I would take them through several different cleansing techniques. And of course, that depends on what the crystal is. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's talk about cleansing, because as you mentioned, people here, you can do full moon or you can do new moon or you can do water. And I guess the answer is it depends on what the crystal is. And that depends a little bit on your knowledge, So a very simple way of looking at it is all crystals had a particular hardness. Yeah, there's a scale that that measures the hardness. And I'm not going to do it to this crystal, but if you were to take your nail and run it and it creates a groove in it, it's too soft for water. So, things like lepidolite, things like selenite, these are crystals that you shouldn't really wash in water because they're going to start falling apart on you. Even things like amethyst that has that's not sealed properly, where the bottom part of the amethyst is a little bit earthy. You're going to start with water, falling apart. So you would usually do techniques like white sage, especially for those listeners that have hundreds of crystals. Rather than washing individually a crystal, just get a big box. If you have the opportunity, do it outside so you don't set off the fire alarm. Get some white sage, sage the box, close it, and just let this crystal sit there for an hour or two with the white sage. Don't burn the box down. For the harder crystals, water is good, and even sort of seawater or ocean water is good. If you're looking at, as I said, crystal that you've just used and it wasn't highly charged, yeah, running it underwater for 1 minute with good intention, may be enough. But a lot of crystals come from the earth. Most crystals are from underneath the earth. There are some that you just find on the surface. You walk around aragonite and just pick up. But if they're from the earth, if they spend most of their life in the dirt, then one of the ways of cleansing them and even charging them, it depends on how long you do it for, is actually burying them back into earth. And obviously you would want the soil not to be contaminated with some fertilizer or something like that. And this is sort of where, if I feel that the crystal is not vibrating, or if I feel that the session we went through was really highly charged, I might choose to bury the crystals for at least a month, and in some cases actually much longer. And so I do have a nice story about it, if you want to hear it, about charging crystals and burying crystals, and the impact, that it has. But,
Sure, because right now I'm imagining my dogs digging up crystal treasure all over the yard as we would bury them to charge them. So that's amusing me. Yeah.
yeah, and you might bury them and never find them. That's
Yeah.
the other thing, and you just have to take that risk. If you bury them in a pot and don't find them, well, that's something's gone wrong somewhere. But one of the things that I say to my students when I teach this is, I say, our time is not a crystal time. We live for 50, 60, 80, 100 years. That's a fleeting moment in a crystal life. A lot of crystals have been around for thousands, in some cases millions of years. And so what is a month to a crystal? Nothing. It's a split moment. And I remember, I'll share this with you. I was in Sedona, which is Arizona, United States, quite an energetic place. And I was taking a group of people there on a sort of like a crystal trip. We just came from Tucson. It's the biggest gem show in the world. If you ever get a chance to go to Tucson in February, do so. And we were doing this process of returning crystals back to the earth. I mean, if you're buying crystals, you have to sort of understand that you are part of the industry of removing them. So we were doing this process of burying crystals, returning them back to the earth. And of course, to do this properly, we would bury our favorite pieces, not a tumblestone. And the story is that I've done this few years in a row, and basically I was just lucky enough to be able to sort of find these crystals that we buried 2 years back. And so I'm sort of digging this hole, and it was just a chance. I didn't actually know where it was. And we get these crystals that I buried 2 years ago. And I was really happy. Like, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get my, Lemurian. I had this huge piece of Lemurian that I buried there. It was there for 2 years. And so I've removed it, and I'm like, thinking, I'm gonna take this home. And then, of course, one of my students says to me, Ondrej, do you think that it's been in the earth for long enough? Because your intention was sort of to return it, and so it can charge, and so it can, heal itself a bit. And I said to my student, well, it's been 2 years. 2 years is 2 years. And they said, yes, but, when you were teaching us, you said, what's a year to a crystal? Only a fleeting moment. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe 2 years is not enough, but I'll give the crystal a chance. So just imagine, I mean, it was about 2 degrees, right? So we're talking February, Arizona. And high up in Sedona. And so I've got this crystal in my hand, and I just asked the crystal, I said, would you want to come home with me to Sydney? And the crystal is saying, yes, yes, yes. And of course, when I say the crystal saying yes, that's just my mind talking to myself, right? She's going, yes, 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 I want to come home. And then I get this sort of thought form in my head going, oh, maybe I should give it a chance. And so I just had this, thought, or would you prefer to stay here? And as I had that thought, I get a cramp in my arm and literally it falls back into the hole. It's like, oh God, I really wanted to take it home. So we left it there and I came back each year. And it was only after 8 years that actually I had a sense of, okay, yeah, we can take it home. So it's a sort of the longest time that I remember burying crystals with the intention of one day removing them. It's about 8 years. So yeah, returning back to the earth is a great way of cleansing, but also charging. Charging would take much longer, cleansing, probably a couple of weeks.
I was going to ask you if you would ever muscle test to see, like, was that long enough or something like that? And then you told me that your arm cramped up, and I'm like, that's a muscle test. I mean, that is
Yeah.
a response. So,
Yeah, look, if you're a kinesiologist, you definitely can muscle test for this. It depends on how, I guess, sensitive you are. Some people are sensitive and they can pick up crystals and they just get a sense, it still needs more cleansing. It's not vibrating well. And I'll talk about what that actually is. But if you don't, you can muscle test. The only thing with muscle testing is make sure that you're not influencing the outcome because of the limited resource. And what I mean by that is, if I have one selenite and I've buried that and I need to use that selenite in my clinic and then I'm muscle testing, doesn't need to stay in earth a bit longer, I'm not sure. Is it going to actually show yes, or is it going to go, yes, I want it in clinic because I actually need it. So, don't be tied up to that you actually need it right now when you're muscle testing, because that's going to give you probably a better response. Try to stay out of that. But yeah, you can muscle test. And of course, burying is not the only way. So you've got the moonlight, you've got water. A lot of crystals respond well to things like Himalayan salt or just salt itself. But salt itself is actually a little bit corrosive. It's a little bit harsh for a lot of crystals. So what I would usually do is get, blocks of salt. We're talking Himalayan salt, the red salt. Do a spread and then put some piece of wood on top of that, and then put the crystals on top of the wood. So they're not actually touching the salt, but they are in the vicinity of the salt or even next to a salt lamp. That's another good way of cleansing crystals. Some people use certain tools. Some people have sprays and they use sound, to cleanse crystals. Frequencies can, obviously help with bringing up other frequencies. So there's a lot of variety, but I guess what I want to, I'm going to let this go now because I can talk about cleansing crystals for hours. But what I want to sort of really get across is cleansing crystals is probably the most important thing that you should do if you're going to be using them. If you're using crystals and you're not cleansing them, I would not recommend it. They're just not going to work.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then let's move from that. So let's say we've got them cleansed, right? How do we actually work with these in a session? You've alluded to it a little bit with something like a selenite or something like that, but how do you use them?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, I actually teach, a few different courses called Crystal Kinesiology 1, Crystal Kinesiology 2. And in that, we sort of break down what are the different aspects of crystals and how we can use that in clinic. So to say how do you use them, there probably is a requirement of a little bit of knowledge, which crystal I would use for what. But let's break that down a little bit. So when we look at physics, there is a particular rule around vibration. Basically, everything in the universe has a particular vibration. And this rule is when you have two vibrations that are similar to each other, they will start to coalesce. They will start to act the same way. A good example of this is if you have a room of grandfather clocks, and all the grandfather clocks are ticking in a different way. If you actually leave them there for a month, they will just synchronize. Yeah, and what's happening there is that the dominant frequency, the one that is the lowest in this case, the ones that the most stable one, is going to become the lead frequency, and all the other clocks will try to mimic it and get to the same synchrony. Now that happens all the time. So we've got thousands of crystals, but if you actually look at them under microscope, there's only 7 different forms of crystals. Yeah, and this is how they grow. So for example, you might get things like trigonal structure, and if you've never seen this before, think beehive. Think bees. When they make beehives, they make hexagonal shapes, and they make it so they use up the space the most optimal way. And so when we're looking at crystals, when they grow in particular patterns. These are called structural patterns, like trigonal, tetragonal, and that's so the space can be perfectly filled out. And when you look at it on a microscope, that particular structure is flawless. It's absolutely perfect. Yeah, and part of that is because crystals are much less organic than humans. So when they grow slowly, it is very, very stable. Now, humans, we are much more organic. We have cells that rebuild themselves. We have tissue salts that rebuild themselves. And when you look at our cells under a microscope, they actually have quite similar structures. And not exactly like crystals, but it's similar enough that those 2 frequencies would actually try to vibrate to each other. And here's the most important thing. Because we're much more organic and because we build and rebuild, our structures are nowhere near as uniform as crystals. And so when you actually take a crystal in your hand, or when you take a crystal and put it around someone, it's not so much that the crystal is healing you. It's more that the crystal has a particular very stable frequency, and our body tries to mimic it. And as our body tries to mimic it, the crystal, by emanating this frequency, is actually helping my body to reorganize itself. So even without not knowing anything about crystals, as long as they've been cleansed, as long as they're vibrating, by placing a crystal around someone, you are helping the body to bring itself back into more balance, into more homeostasis, into a more stable vibration. So that's sort of like a very basic explanation on vibrations and how crystals can have an effect on us. But we can go deeper into that, and we can, for example, look at the law of homeopathics, like treats like. And one of the things that is really important in our body is things like minerals. We use minerals for almost every process. I work with a lot of kids that have learning difficulties. The first thing that I'm really interested in is how much magnesium, how much zinc do they have in their body. If you're really low on a mineral, that or very high, that's a problem. And so the reason why crystals have a particular color is because of the minerals. Yeah, so all crystals have a particular minerals in them: magnesium, manganese, selenium, calcium is calcite. And when we start thinking about laws from homeopathics, like treats like, well, if a crystal has particular minerals, and I am working as a practitioner with someone that either needs to absorb that mineral better, or needs to utilize that mineral better, or there's something going on with the way the body's processing mineral, then I would use the crystal that contains that mineral as part of my session. Yeah. So, and of course, you can do it the other way around as well. Like treats like, if I have someone that has heavy metal toxicity, then I would look at crystals that contain the heavy metals and use them in the session, because then I can work on goals like, my body eliminates mercury, or my body eliminates aluminium effectively. And when I'm working with that, I would be using crystals that contain aluminium, that contain mercury, because it's going to help the body to sort of understand what that mineral is. Yeah, so you can sort of do it both for elimination and both for building up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean those principles of entrainment are really the basis of, I think, all of the corrections that we do in energy medicine and energetic kinesiology. It's really just that, to my way of thinking, the crystal gives you something that holds that stable pattern. So it means that we're not relying on me as the practitioner being able to hold a very particular frequency or a stable pattern at that moment. We have something else that is providing that template or that vibrational structure, right?
Yeah,
But
you can look at it that way. Yeah.
yeah, but I've never looked at doing it for something toxic, like that idea of working with it that way. So now I'm kind of going, okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, let me share a story with you. Most people would recognize amethyst. Right? It's a quite a common stone. Now, Alexi, do you know why amethyst is called an amethyst?
I do not.
Well, actually, amethyst has been used by people for thousands of years. There are stories of the Roman army, we're talking ancient Rome, grinding amethyst into the food of the soldiers after a big night out because it would detoxify them and get ready for battle quicker. Um, the story of amethyst goes back to Greek mythology. There's this girl, she's walking through the gardens of Diana. She's the goddess of moon and hunt. And this girl's walking through the gardens, and Dionysus, he's the god of mischief and wine, sees her, and he decides that he's going to capture her. And he sends his tigers to get her. But as the tigers are approaching this girl, Diana sees this, and what she does, she encloses this girl in a crystal to protect her. And the tigers can't get her, Dionysus can't get her. So when he approaches this girl in the crystal, he gets his goblet of wine, he pours it over the crystal, it turns purple, and the girl's name was Amethyst. And since then, all quartz crystals that are purple are named amethyst. So it protects us. It protects us against alcohol. It protects us overall. And amethyst actually in Greek means without drunkenness, and it has been used for in different civilizations exactly for that. As I said, Roman army grinds amethyst into the soldiers' food to try to get them ready for battle after a big night out. In the Middle Ages, amethyst was used as one of the potions, I guess, grinding amethyst when people were poisoned to try to get the poison out of your body. But we can say, oh yeah, that's ancient history, whatever. There is a company in Japan called Kenrico, and what they make is foot patches. These are patches that you stick at the bottom of your feet to draw toxins. There's different companies that make it. Personally, Kenrico, I believe, is one of the best companies. And they have a lot of editions of different patches. And one of the editions is called Gold Edition. And when you look at the ingredients, what they put into these patches to draw toxicity out of the body, two top ingredients, amethyst and green tourmaline. So Kenrico makes, like, I'm making this up, 10 million patches a month. I mean, it's a massive, massive company. They're one of the leading companies of detoxing through patches. So even in today's industry, we use amethyst to draw toxicity out of the body, like physically, not as practitioners, companies that use it. It's a stone that has huge protection. Because again, the story sort of tells that. Not going too much into religion, but if you actually look at, say, the Christianity faith, most bishops will have two rings. I'm going to dare say that they might not even know the reasons for these rings, because it's been passed down through centuries and centuries. This has been happening for millennia. The rings is ruby and amethyst. That's what the rings are. And there's reasons for that, because amethyst is a huge protective stone. It protects us energetically. It protects us from poison. It protects us from alcohol. So, sometimes knowledge about crystals helps me to then choose crystals. So if I have someone that has toxicity, someone that has alcoholism, or someone that needs protection, because they are perhaps too open and they're too sensitive to things coming in, then having amethyst on them or having amethyst next to the bed, so so they are in that field of amethyst often, would be something that I would use. And of course, for them, I would use amethyst in sessions as well, as a correction.
Mhm. All of my kids have always loved working with gemstones, but my oldest son especially, and he was one of those kids that was just always playing with them, right? Always in my office playing with them, and he would organize them and he would move them and he would do things with them. And then was one of those kids where, I say kids, he's 21 now, but like he always has a rock in his pocket, right? Um, and often for those reasons, for kind of keeping those energetic boundaries. But he's also my kid where, if I wasn't feeling well, he would quietly come and, be a little line of stones next to my computer, next to my book, because rocks mean love. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Alexia, I know that you work with a lot of vibration stuff, and something for the listeners, at least in Sydney, people tend to understand that some of us are quite intolerant to things like gluten, or that they are quite intolerant to things like milk. That sort of concept that, oh yeah, look, some people can eat bread and it has gluten in it and just no response whatsoever. Others eat it and it actually really mucks them up, right? So that on a biochemical level, most people, I would say, have some kind of an understanding. We can take exactly the same concept into the energetic world. And what happens is that some people are very, very sensitive to vibrations and others not so much. So if you are sensitive to vibrations, you might be affected, things like Wi-Fi. I mean, I have clients where unless they turn the router off at night, they can't sleep. And the router is like 10 meters away. So some people are very sensitive to sort of this, not even energetic, it's electrical stuff, magnetic stuff. And for them, using crystals for protection, for example, might be very, very beneficial. Because by them bringing that crystal into their field and they are so sensitive, it will just give them that a little bit of protection where they're not going to react so much. So for example, when I'm working with clients that are sensitive to electricity, I say, look, next to your screen, you want to have quartz. For example, you want to have something that has a point like this, in front of your screen. Next to your router, however, you probably want to have shungite. And if you can't get shungite, you probably want to have, shungite is 99% carbon. That's what they use in filters to cleanse things. You want to have black tourmaline. So there are certain stones that have a very good effect on negating, let's call the magnetic and electric fields that we use in a household. So shungite, black obsidian to a certain degree, black tourmaline definitely, quartz with S points. These are all crystals that can be used, to give us some protection from magnetic stuff. And there's more, but there's sort of the key ones there. So one thing, I'm just sort of thinking how kinesiologists could use crystals. So I guess a little bit of knowledge is always good, because when we start looking at crystals and what they are good for, we start seeing strong associations between crystals and other different systems. So for example, crystals and chakras, crystals and 5 elements. Yeah. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Fluoride. Yeah. Fluoride is a crystal that often has a purple color or green color. Actually, with the exception of red, it can come in any color. And it is associated to the brow chakra. If it's very green, it can be associated to the heart chakra. And when we start looking at crystals and using them for chakras, if your knowledge isn't great, then probably use color. That's going to be probably the easiest way of doing it. However, when we start looking at things like fluoride, we can also relate it to the element of wood. Now, it's not because of the green, because even fluoride that's purple would still be related to wood. And the reason behind that is that fluoride actually is one of the best stones that helps us with stabilizing emotions, especially anger. Yeah, so if I start looking at someone that is often angry and they just can't stabilize that, then fluoride would be one of the better stones for that. Another stone, for example, would be orange calcite. Orange calcite, usually a pretty cheap stone. Calcite is the second most abundant stones around the planet. If you're ever buying calcites, you shouldn't be paying too much money. You should be able to find big chunks of calcite at not a huge cost. And orange calcite, because of its color, often is associated to the sacral chakra. It is great for creativity. It is great for relationships. However, when we start looking at orange calcite in relationship to elements, well, fire element, not because of its color, but one of the descriptions in orange calcite is that it's actually sometimes called the happy stone. When you hold orange calcite in your hand, you just sort of almost like start feeling happy, because one of the things that orange calcite does is it increases our joy. But it also helps us to let go of sorrow and grief. And so by letting go of sorrow and grief, I can find that inner joy. And so when I'm balancing, for example, the 5 elements, I might be working with the metal element. Maybe there's some grief or sorrow that I need to go through, or my client needs to find more inner joy. So maybe I'm working with the fire element. And in both cases, I might use orange calcite as a way of enhancing that, because that crystal, that's part of its, I'm not going to say raw, but that's part of what it's used for, to increase joy and to help us to let go of grief. So, for kinesiologists, whenever you're working with chakras, then consider adding a crystal as part of your process. You could have been taught to do 7 chi keys. You could have been taught chakra hologram. You could have been taught many different ways of working with chakras, but why not add the crystal? So like 7 chi keys. Have you done 7 chi keys, Alexis? It's
I
one of
have not. I'm familiar with it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of Charles Krebs courses. Actually, it's sort of more like Richard Atz courses, really.
Richardette's courses. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember it's Richard Atz, and I learned it through Charles. They use a Tai Chi and they stimulate acupuncture points. And for what's called a density balance, they would have to stimulate like 24 points within 2 minutes. And it's like, a lot of work. But what I do is, if I'm, for example, working with, say, base chakra and 7 chi keys comes up, I would do that correction as, Richard, I put it, but then I would circulocate the acupuncture points and see which ones need a little bit more work, and I would stick a crystal on it. And the crystal that I would use, of course, would be a crystal that I know would be very beneficial for base chakra issues. So this could be black obsidian, black tourmaline, any actually earthly red or black crystals might be beneficial. And this brings me to a point: what crystals should you have in your clinic? Because if I have something like this, well, I'm not going to be sticking that on. That's good to put under the bed, but if I need to put it on acupuncture points, I'm actually going to need very, very small pieces. So I actually have very small pieces of red jasper and black tourmaline. And so after I do, my 24-point stimulation, I might put these little pieces just with a little sticky tape on 4, 5, 6 points and just leave it there for the rest of the session. Where pieces like this, they're good for the body, they don't fall off. I can hold it in my hand. And then more significant pieces would often go next to the table or under the table or just in the room. So, as a practitioner, we also need to be thinking, what form do I want the crystals in so they are easily used in clinic? If I'm sticking them on acupoints, like alarm points, for example, you're probably going to need smaller pieces. If I'm placing them in the chakras or holding them, you're probably going to be better off with more vibrational pieces, bigger pieces. So I usually try to get a variation so I can use it in different ways. So definitely crystals and their associations to 5 elements, yep. Associations to chakras, yep. But as I mentioned before, each crystal also has minerals. And, the kinesiology that we teach in Sydney, one of our subjects looks at how to work with deficiencies and excess of minerals and heavy metals. And for that, we would use crystals as well. We definitely, if I've got someone that is low in magnesium, I would choose in that session to place crystals around the client that are high in magnesium to sort of help that body to recognize that particular vibration.
Right. Yeah, in session, I do something similar to what you were describing with, doing an energetic correction and then maybe putting a stone on a point or on a chakra in order to keep that vibration. I also have, I don't know, this is one that I use in, probably the one I use in clinic the most because it's got a little point on it. And this one was a gift from one of my students in Russia, but you can shine a, because of the way it's cut. I don't know if it shows properly through the camera, but you can put a light on it and you can kind of double up your vibration. And I can use this instead of something like a taishan to stimulate specific points. But that kind of brings me to something else that I had wanted to ask you, and I kept it in my head while you were talking because you had mentioned back when you were talking about crystals, maybe beside your computer, you were very specific about how that quartz should have a point. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, because I've acquired different things over the years, as so many of us have. So, I've got things that are pyramids, and I've got things that are big raw stones, and I've got eggs, and I've got cute little hearts. And like, does to me, they have different feels to them. And I was curious what your thought was on that, like the different feel that a different shape has. And are there some shapes that are more for certain purposes and some that should be avoided? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I guess the first question is the shape natural or has it been carved that way? That's the first thing. Because, for example, with quartz, they grow with points. Now,
Mhm.
the point that you have, the one that you showed me, that's not the way it grown. I mean, it
No,
probably
but like
was a
this one,
that's
this is a
that's one. That's
natural point, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So often if someone's cutting crystals and they know what they're doing, they would take that point that you just showed me and they would cut it and still follow the natural shapes of the crystal. So often what you end up with is really clear points, very sharp points, but they actually cut it in the way the crystal has grown. And that's very important because that still allows that energy to flow through it. So points, if you have a crystal like this, the energy travels from here and comes out and concentrates on here. So if I'm using something like that, like the one that you have, holding that on acupuncture points or holding that on chakras is a good idea. Yeah. You have to be a little bit careful. Because with the energetic body, if you're using something very sharp, you don't want to be moving too quickly. So, for example, if I'm doing figure eights, I actually wouldn't use a crystal that has a sharp point. I would use something that is more flat because you don't want to, create other problems by, cutting the
Slashing.
slashing the energetic field. So You are right. It takes me to two different directions. I talked about cleansing, but I haven't talked much about charging. Sometimes people ask me, okay, Ondrej, how do I charge crystals? And, there's a lot of information in books, with intention. You can hold a crystal and, have some intention and charge it that way. Sunlight actually is a good medium to charge crystals. You probably don't want to overdo it because sunlight can be stripping as well, especially for crystals that have a lot of color. But if you need to sort of awaken the crystal, sunlight is good. But I found the easiest and I guess the best way of charging crystals is by using a particular crystal only for particular type of stress. Yeah. Now think of it like this. If we do a task, we might be good at it. But if I do the same task 100 times, hopefully I'm going to be excellent at it. Hopefully I've figured out all the things. So you had a crystal there that was shaped like a heart. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I have a crystal in my clinic, which is shaped like a heart. It's quite a big piece. And not only is it shaped like a heart, but I've got it in rose quartz, which is very good for heart chakra. And so that particular piece, this is not the piece, this is rose quartz, but that particular piece that I only have been using for the last 10 years for clients when we are working with the heart chakra. Nothing else. I've got other rose quartz that we can use for a lot of other things, but that piece only work for heart chakra issues. And because I've probably done 1,000 balances where we work with heart chakra and we've only used that piece becomes almost like better and better at its job, because that's what it does. And so when people ask me, how do I charge crystals to do a particular thing? I say, well, choose crystals and use them for something specific and only use them for that. You still need to cleanse it, but the crystal almost like becomes used to that vibration. This is what I do. I work with the heart chakra and that's it. And it becomes better and better at it. You start feeling, a lot of my clients, you put that crystal on, it's like, wow. But that only started happening after I used it many, many times. So that's one way of charging crystals. Back to your question about shapes. For example, it's a bit hard to pick up, but this crystal here, as you can see, it's a quartz. It's got a base, and there's probably 1,000 little little towers there. So crystals that have the same base, but they have lots of different crystals growing out of it, they are usually used for families and groups. They can be used on an individual that has difficulties with integrating into groups, or that has, when there's family dynamics. The representation is that we share the same base, but we are all individuals. And that, that shape comes naturally. Often we find quartz crystals that have same base, but a lot of different, crystals growing for it. So whenever I'm working with an individual that has difficulties with integrating into groups, or being, belonging to a group, but still being the individual, being them, then the first choice of crystals is, should we use a cluster? Cluster would be good in this session. And I might even recommend for families to get clusters of crystals and put them in rooms where, the dynamics often blow up. So, let's just all agree that, hey, we are part of the same family. We are sharing the same household. Yes, we can be individual, but, there's a compromise there. And that crystal will help to create that sort of vibration. Spheres. So when you have crystals that are cut into spheres, they are amazing for rooms. The energy from a sphere goes into every direction. So often when students ask me, I want to get a nice piece for the room, what should I get? My first answer is get a sphere. That's going to hold the room energy really well. What crystal you get sort of a little bit depends on either what you can afford, because spheres can be expensive, or what is the energy that you want to create in the room. So if you sort of want to create a more compassion, loving energy in your clinic room, then rose sphere or maybe a sphere from moonstone would be really, really good. Whereas if you sort of more want to create energy which is safe, which is, more grounded, people come in and they want to, then you're probably looking at a sphere out of black tourmaline or black obsidian, something more, or maybe earthly colors, maybe like red jasper or something like that. Whereas if you want to bring the energy up in the room, want to have a bit more vibrant, then probably clear quartz or one of the quartz families would be good. So spheres are good for rooms. Clusters are good for groups and families. Points are good for directing energy. Now, you do sometimes get naturally, but also you get man-made, where they make the points on both sides. And these are called double terminators. So if you have often they are clear quartz, but they can be others. If you have a crystal that has points on both sides, those are called double terminators, and they are very, very good at increasing flow. So not directing, but increasing flow. And so, if you're working with a meridian and there is pain somewhere, usually that would mean there is some kind of a stagnation there. You would put the way the meridian runs, you put it in the direction that it runs, and you would leave it there. If you're working with two chakras and they're next to each other, let's say it's, heart and solar plexus, then you would put it in between. So you put the double point in between the chakras and, maybe palm both at the same time. So you have double terminators to increase flow, single terminators to direct, clusters for groups, families, spheres for room. And then, some crystals like heart shape can be used specifically for heart chakra, or if you're trying to use that crystal for compassion or something like that, then that, you might use it that way. Pyramids, that's a whole nother topic. It depends on how the pyramids actually cut. You can go into sacred geometry with pyramids. You get some crystals that are actually cut into pyramids where the height and the length follows pi. You need someone that knows what they're doing. Then they have a whole different vibrations. Sometimes pyramids is someone just does this and, here you are. But generally, you're looking at a broad base into a point. Not so much maybe on an acupoint, but good for rooms. Pyramid is Shungai pyramid, for example, is something that I would recommend in front of a router. If you can get your hands on a Shungai pyramid, that's very good for helping with, disturbing sort of those magnetic electric fields.
Yeah, I have pieces of shungite for working with that. This one's obsidian, and I think of it more as a Neff collector
Yeah.
in the
Oh,
corner of the room.
I,
Um,
I can tell you stories about obsidian if you want. But I've got a piece of obsidian. It's very small, so he's a piece of obsidian. And obsidian actually, when you look at the structure, they have a structure called amorphous. It means no structure at all. Under microscope, they've got no structure, and the reason is that obsidian is lava that falls into water, and it's made instantly. It's like glass, like boom, like obsidian. And something that I was reading in an anthropology article, they found these burial sites. I think it was in Kenya. It was definitely in Africa. I think it was in Kenya. Found these burial sites, and within the burial sites, they had pieces of black obsidian shaped like this. Basically, pieces that definitely have been worked by someone, to make a point. Because being glass, if you take a heavier rock and you hit it, it will shatter and create very, very sharp edges. And guess how old that burial site was? I mean, they did carbon testing on, the bones and things like that. Guess how old the burial site was where these pieces have been found?
I have no idea. I mean, I've heard of them being used as arrowheads, right? I have no clue. Tell me how long.
310,000 years. It blows my mind. Yes, arrowheads, American Indians, they use shale, and if you're very good, you use black obsidian. Different cultures use that. But I was always thinking, oh yeah, okay, well, we're sort of in the late Stone Age. So I'm thinking, okay, yeah, 10,000 years ago, maybe there's people making arrowheads from these. 310,000 years ago, there's already people shaping black obsidian. It's crazy. I mean, that's, that history is really big. Black obsidian, by the way, if you polish, if you look at it, it's actually like a mirror. They used to have slabs of black obsidian where you would really polish and you look at it, and it's like literally like a mirror. So black obsidian is actually one of the best stones to deeply look inside yourself. Yeah. If I'm working with someone and you need to literally cut shit out, sorry for the swearing, because they're just in their head, they just can't get deep, they just can't get to the core problem. Black obsidian. We usually use a little bit of rose quartz with it. Let's get that out. We still
Soften
love
it.
you. Let's soften the blow a little bit. But I have done sessions where black obsidians can be very harsh. Like it's not. When I say harsh, it just reveals truth. And some people, they don't want to see it. Like they don't want to go deep inside and look at what it actually is. Like, yes, this is your fault. You need to do something about it. So that can be used for that. It is a good grounding stone. Black tourmaline to black obsidian as a grounding stone. If I often create images in my head, what a crystal would look like if I would change it to a character. Black tourmaline is your warrior monk. Very stable. You can't push this. Very strong, stable on earth, base chakra stuff. Black obsidian is like a ninja. Yeah. So, very sharp, very quick. You can get sometimes people that are not connecting to things. You include black obsidian session and suddenly it's like, whoa, we've just cut through it. And can be used for grounding. Yes, can be used for nafs. Absolutely. It's one of those stones that you want to cleanse perhaps more than others, because it holds stuff. Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Amazing. We should probably wrap up this conversation. I know that we could do this all night.
Yeah.
But just to keep this of like a watchable length for people, maybe we'll do a second one at some point. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing stories and ideas. And we'll put maybe some contact info for you in the description for the video so that anyone who's interested in finding out more, getting in touch about your classes, anything of that sort has an easy way of contacting you. Anything that you want to tell us the name of your school so that people can find you?
Oh yeah, look, I'm in Sydney, Australia, College of Complementary Medicine. We run professional courses for kinesiology. We have a CRICOS approval for international students. But if you're sort of interested in crystals, I do run sometimes crystal workshops, Crystal Kinesiology 1 and 2, and I have run them online as well. It is crystal sort of better to do face to face because you sort of want to touch things and do things. But I have done that online and usually try to get, my students to have some crystals with them. So when we're talking online, they can actually hold it and, have them with them. So, but yeah, thank you. Always love talking about crystals, and yeah, I'll be happy to, choose another topic or, expand on this one.
Lovely. Thank you.